have open the AI0601_done file. You can see this has many different gradients and fill patterns applied to it. I also have open the start file, just a black and white version, just to get us started with gradients and patterns. I'm going to click on the zoom tool, zoom into the top area, and then switch to the selection tool and select this ribbon. I'm going to add these two other parts of the ribbon to this selection just by holding down the shift key and clicking on those two elements. So now I have the entire ribbon selected. I want to save that selection. Anytime that I make a complex selection, I typically want to save that selection so I don't have to go through that process again. So I use the select menu, choose save selection, and call it ribbon. So now I can go to my swatches panel. I'm just going to apply a summer red radial fill. So I make sure that my fill tile is brought to the front, and I can click on that. I could also have just used the control panel to do that. I'm going to collapse that swatches panel, move my artboard to the side. I want to show you around this gradient tool for a moment. I'm just going to create a rectangle. Then I'm going to switch to my gradient tool. When I do that, you can see I can directly manipulate this gradient. I can change the size of the gradient or the spread of the gradient, compress or expand that gradient, also rotate that gradient around, and I can also manipulate the color values of this gradient. So I can double click on the color stop to change the color value. I can do it with any of these color stops. Now if I want to add a color stop, I simply hover underneath that color ramp. You can see I get the small plus sign next to my cursor. That means when I click, I can add a color stop. I can also click and drag down just to remove those color stops. So really easy to directly manipulate these gradients. I'm just going to delete that. I want to show you one other thing with this gradient tool, is that if I have multiple shapes and I switch to my selection tool and select those three shapes and then switch to my gradient tool, you can see that each one of these shapes has its own gradient applied. Now what I can also do with the gradient tool is I can click and drag throughout those shapes and apply one gradient that passes through the entire selection. So no longer do these three shapes have their own individual gradients, they now actually just inherit one gradient that passes all the way through. Quite a neat little feature there. Okay, so back to my main file. This time I'm going to use the group selection tool, and I'm just going to shift click on a few of these elements. I'm going to bring up the gradient panel, just position this so we can see it, and I can change the values on this. So maybe I could switch it to a linear gradient. I could use the gradient tool again just to change the path, and I could remove a color stop. I can change color values, and if I want to reuse this gradient in the future, I can open my swatches panel and actually click from the gradient panel, that preview, into the swatches panel, and you can see that added that swatch into the new swatches panel, and you can see that added that gradient into my swatches panel. I can always double click on that and give it a new name if I want. So now I can reuse that swatch wherever I desire. What I'm going to do now is select this large shape here, and I'm going to apply a linear gradient. So from a gradient panel, just choose linear gradient. I have to zoom out just a little to see what I'm working on. Back to the gradient tool, I can have it pass through. I can change the angle of that. I can obviously change these color values by double clicking on the color stops. I'm going to make it black and white respectively. And again, if I want to save this, I can click and drag from the gradient panel onto the swatches panel, double click to rename it if I want. And now I can apply that to other shapes by making my selection and clicking on that black and white gradient, switching to the gradient tool and using that to pass through all of those options. So you can see it's quite easy to manipulate these gradients visually and directly with the tool and the panel. So now let's take a look at patterns. I'm going to switch to the rectangle tool and just a regular fill. Click and drag with the shift key held down just to constrain those proportions, make it a square, rotate it around 45 degrees to get a diamond. I'm just going to zoom in a little. With the selection tool, I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key just to duplicate that shape. Now drag a selection around those three shapes. Now again, I can always click and drag this into the swatches panel to save that off, and this time it is a fill pattern. So I'm just going to delete my shape on the artboard, Command or Control 0 to zoom out. Now I can drag a rectangle around this whole file and send it to the back by right clicking, Control click on the Mac, choose Arrange, Send to Back, and I can change my fill to this pattern by just making sure I have the fill tile brought forward and clicking on the pattern swatch. I'm just going to change this to none for a second. I want to show you another option, is I can draw my shape. I'm just going to give it a black fill this time and rotate it around. Again, zoom in. So very similar to what I just did. And I can change the individual colors, obviously. And maybe I want to resize this. Now what I'm going to do is, I have three separate shapes. I'm going to add a fourth shape to this. This is going to be my bounding box, which is going to give me some negative space. So I need to remove the stroke and the fill. With that done, I can drag a selection around that bounding box and those three individual elements, and then group those together. So Object and Group. Now when I drag this into the swatches panel, what it actually does is it honors that negative space as well. So I select my background, this time apply my new pattern. You can see that bounding box gives me that negative space around that swatch. An easy way to replace a gradient or a fill is if I obviously select the element, I can switch that out. If I have multiple things that have the same value applied to them, I can click on one of them, choose Select, Same Fill, and then use my new pattern. Or gradient to change those. So hopefully I've given you some options that you can use to take advantage of gradients and patterns in your own illustrations.